Hello. One of the commonest errors that people commit when discussing various philosophical, cultural, and social issues with one another is the category error. The notion of a category error is extremely important in philosophy, which is why already Aristotle made sure to discuss it in his aptly named categories. By saying Socrates, I refer to Socrates. When I say Socrates is a man, I introduce a category, man, that includes items that are not Socrates. So how do those items help me understand the first item, Socrates? Understanding categories helps us understand reality, the objects with which we interact, and the situations in which we find ourselves. The idea of a category error, sometimes known as a category mistake, was discussed by the British philosopher Gilbert Ryle in his book The Concept of Mind, published in 1949 as part of his attack on Cartesian dualism, an effort I wholeheartedly support, but that's another story. The category error has since then broadened somewhat to mean the following: an error that occurs when someone presents objects belonging to one category as belonging to another, or when someone puts objects in the same category when they are in fact part of different categories. This might sound fairly technical, but it is in fact a mistake that people commit all the time without being aware of it, and which invalidates their arguments. A stock example offered by Ryle himself in his book is when someone asks to see the university, and he's shown the buildings, the professors, and the students. The person acknowledges that he can see the buildings, the professors, and the students, but wonders where the university itself is. He doesn't realize that the word university is only an abstraction composed of the buildings, students, professors, etc. And so we can conclude from this that the person places university and, for example, student in the same category as two things of the same type that can therefore be compared with one another, whereas in fact they cannot be compared in this way. And so the person has committed a category error. Now, the category error is one of the commonest mistakes people make when arguing with one another. And so to demolish your friends' arguments, you can point out their category errors to them and then watch your circle of friends rapidly dwindle. So let's take some examples. In this image by Grayson Perry, the illustrator makes a good point. Visitors in an art gallery treat politics, ideas, and humor as belonging to some category other than art. By art, they seem to mean something like skill. Now, even though it is true that the etymological meaning of the word art is in fact skill, today we use the word art as a much more complex abstraction which can include elements of humor, politics, and various other ideas. And in fact, I have another video on this channel on the category of art. So, what the viewers consider to be positive, lovely politics, great idea, very funny, are precisely the things that form part of the art itself. And so the conclusion, shit art, as something separate from the humor and the politics is false. That is to say, the error sets up politics and humor as separate categories, whereas in fact the politics and the humor are part of the art category in this case. That is to say that the politics or the humor is an attribute of the art. Now, one must be careful because it is possible to categorize things in different but equally valid ways depending on the context. It would not be unreasonable to say that politics and art are two different categories in many contexts. For example, politics is a pure abstraction, while art can also be a physical object, and even as an abstraction, art is still, of course, something very different from politics. But when one visits an art museum, it is a good guess that the political statement of an artwork is part of the category of art, and so, in that context, it becomes a category error to separate them. So context matters. When you talk about an apple, you might be thinking about the category fruit, in which case it wouldn't make sense to compare the apple with pizza. But if you're placing the apple in the category food, then of course all of a sudden the comparison with pizza would make sense. The last example I'd like to discuss is a bit of a pet peeve of mine, probably because growing up I had to hear it ad nauseum, and it shows that very often people make comparisons without first having clarified in their minds what categories they are discussing, and this leads them into error. So, I'm Jewish, and I received a Jewish upbringing, and a proud declaration that one often hears in some Jewish circles is the following: the Greeks and the Romans are gone, but the Jews are still here. In order to understand the problem with this statement, it helps to think about categories, because things can be compared only if they are in the same category. So what is it that we're comparing here? If we're comparing people, flesh and blood human beings, then the statement is false, because just as there are still Jews, there are also Greeks and Italians. If we're comparing political entities, then the statement is also false, because just as the Roman Empire and the Greek city-states went under, and just as the Greek-speaking successor empires of Alexander the so-called Great went under, so too ancient Israel and ancient Judea went under. Now, modern Israel still exists, of course, but so do modern Greece and modern Italy. Finally, if we're comparing religions, then it is, of course, true that Judaism still exists while Greek and Roman paganism has disappeared. But if this is what we're comparing, then the fault line should not be drawn between Judaism and everything else, but between monotheism and pagan polytheism, because the Christian religion of the late Roman Empire also still exists. In fact, monotheism has certain civilizational advantages that polytheism lacks, as can be seen in the fact that indeed other ancient monotheisms, even if they're not quite as old as Judaism, also still exist and will continue to exist well into the future. And so in the end, by thinking in terms of categories, we can conclude that the statement doesn't work. Respecting Jewish history and admiring the richness of Jewish tradition do not require us to add nonsensical statements to them. Quite the contrary. Not to go off on too much of a tangent here, but one example of the civilizational advantages of monotheism is that a monotheistic God is nebulous enough to have any of his purported faults ascribed to a lack of human understanding or other such factors. A sole transcendent God can be more easily molded according to the evolving needs of a society. Also, such a God, by definition, cannot be killed or conquered, which is less true of gods worshipped as idols, which can be physically taken by the enemy and be shattered or melted down. Part of the genius of monotheism was to remedy this defect. But anyway, that's a whole other story. So while we should always remember that some categories are arbitrary, and that one thing can belong to several different categories at the same time, depending on context and also depending on our own personal definitions, it is still very often useful to think in terms of categories when we try to sort out thorny questions. So there you have it. As always, thank you very much for watching.